Okay, here is the rewritten story of Anne Boleyn's final days, structured into 4 chapters, adopting a new, intense, and theatrical style as requested. Forget the history books painted in muted colors, the polite narratives of political maneuvering and unfortunate royal marriages. This isn't that story. This is a visceral plunge into the final act of a psychological dismantling, a performance designed to strip a queen bare before the blade fell. They tell you about the treason charges, the infidelity, the whisper of incest, absurd theater even then, but they rarely tell you about the terror, the calculated, bone-deep terror of waiting. Imagine this. The human head, severed, can supposedly retain consciousness for up to 30 seconds. 30 long, agonizing seconds. The world spinning, the blood roaring, the horrifying, crystalline realization. I am dead, yet I am. Eyes still seeing, lips still trying to form a scream or a prayer. A final, isolated eternity in a bodiless void. For Anne Boleyn, this wasn't just a morbid thought experiment. This was the chilling potential reality hanging over her like the headsman's axe. Because Anne's end wasn't merely an execution, it was an annihilation. A masterclass in how absolute power can obliterate not just a life, but identity, dignity, and memory itself. By the time she stepped onto that low scaffold on May 19, 1536, Queen Anne, the audacious, the beautiful, the mother of the future Elizabeth I, had already been dying for 17 days. 17 endless days trapped within the stone belly of the Tower of London, the very fortress where she had waited, vibrating with triumph, to be crowned Queen of England just 3 years prior. That grand procession through London, the cheers, the golden light, all faded into the dank, airless reality of a cell designed for traitors. Now, the Tower wasn't a waiting room for glory, but a coffin of stone, slowly suffocating her spirit. And presiding over this drawn-out torment was the man who had once burned with obsession for her, Henry VIII. He wasn't just signing her death warrant, he was directing a horror play. Each postponement of the execution date wasn't a sign of mercy, but another twist of the knife, an added layer to the psychological warfare. The uncertainty was the weapon. Will it be tomorrow, the day after? Hours stretched into eons, every shadow a potential guard coming to fetch her, every distant clang of steel the prelude to her end. And then came the final, chilling detail that underscored the deliberate cruelty. The arrival of the executioner. Not a rough English headsman wielding a crude axe, but a master swordsman, specially commissioned and shipped from Calais, France. History books spin this as Henry's supposed mercy, a cleaner, quicker death for a queen. But those who understood the king's theatrical nature knew better. This wasn't about Anne's comfort, it was about precision, about control, about crafting a perfect, swift, horrifying spectacle for the watching world. The messy, unpredictable hack of an axe wouldn't do. This required the elegant, foreign efficiency of a blade wielded by an artist of death. Anne was not simply being killed, she was being unmade. The charges leveled against her were fantastical, grotesque, aimed not at justice but at character assassination. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother? Plotting the king's murder? Sins so preposterous they would crumble under the slightest scrutiny in any sane court. But truth was irrelevant. The goal was to bury her in enough filth that when she fell, the onlookers would feel not pity, but righteous satisfaction. She had to be proven deserving of destruction in the eyes of the people she had once ruled. Behind every accusation, every delay, every calculated humiliation was Henry, the king who had moved heaven and earth, broken with the Church of Rome, to make her his queen, was now bent on erasing every trace of her existence. He didn't want her remembered as the queen, as the mother of his daughter. He wanted Anne Boleyn to vanish, leaving behind only a stain on history that he could conveniently scrub away with his next queen. Her execution was the final, brutal stroke of that erasure campaign. But the real agony had begun long before she reached the scaffold.
It began the moment the gilded cage of her reign slammed shut, and the stone heart of the tower began its slow, deliberate beat towards her end.
17 days. Try to hold that number in your mind. It doesn't sound long, does it? A little over 2 weeks. But inside the thick, silent walls of the tower, beneath the relentless gaze of the guards who were her only companions, those days didn't pass, they ground. Time became a tormentor, stretching and contracting without reason, dictated only by the king's whim, by the unseen hand manipulating her fate. Every dawn was a reprieve, every sunset a renewed wave of dread. Her cell was a stark contrast to the opulent chambers she had known. Stone, cold and indifferent, minimal furnishings. The view, if there was one, likely limited to a patch of sky or a courtyard, offering no solace. Isolation was absolute. Her loyal ladies-in-waiting, those who had dressed her, attended her, shared her secrets, were largely kept away, replaced by eyes loyal to Cromwell and the king. She was adrift, cut off from any word from the outside world, save for the formal pronouncements of her doom. The psychological torture was subtle, insidious, but relentless. The not knowing, the endless cycle of waiting for a date that was set, then canceled, then rescheduled, then canceled again. Each time her mind would steel itself for the end, only for the order to be withdrawn, forcing her to unpack the mental baggage of death, only to have to repack it again. It's a technique recognized by modern interrogators, break the spirit by robbing it of certainty, of rest, of hope. Cromwell, the architect of her downfall, understood this implicitly. He didn't need physical torture. The tower itself, coupled with the king's capriciousness, was a sufficient instrument. Sleep became a fractured, fleeting thing. Records from the tower show she requested the sacrament, her last rites, at 2 a.m. the night before her execution, a stark, solitary act in the deep, cold hours. She knelt praying for hours, her hands clasped tight enough to ache, her lips moving silently. Was it peace she sought? Forgiveness? Or simply a desperate, primal plea against the inevitable? Exhaustion, fear, and a brittle, desperate strength were her only fuel. By morning, when the lieutenant of the tower came to lead her out, something disquieting had settled upon her. Witnesses described her laughing with her attendants. Perhaps some were allowed back in the final hours, a twisted form of grace. But this wasn't the bright laughter of joy or peace. This was something sharper, more fragile. A sound perhaps born of hysteria, dissociation, the mind building a fragile, temporary shield against the crushing weight of reality. It was the sound of a spirit bending, perhaps on the verge of breaking, finding a strange, dark humor in its own destruction. Her gallows humor, often recounted as evidence of her courage, was in fact a potent indicator of her state. The famous line, "I heard the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck," delivered with a jest, was chillingly revealing. It wasn't just wit, it was a morbid embrace of her fate, a way to control the narrative of her own demise, even as her life was being stolen. Beneath the surface, the terror was absolute. How could it not be? She wasn't just facing death, she was facing erasure. The arrival of the French swordsman from Calais solidified this. His name was Jean Rambaud, though few remember it. He wasn't there to be merciful. He was there to be efficient, to ensure a performance worthy of a king's repudiated queen. The English axe was often messy, requiring multiple blows, a brutal, unpredictable end. Rambaud's sword, a lighter, sharper French blade, was designed for a single, horizontal cut. Clean, fast, controlled. It wasn't about Anne's dignity, it was about Henry's. He wanted a clean break, in every sense of the word. As the moments ticked down on that final morning, the tower wasn't just a prison, it was a crucible. The 17 days had refined her fear into a sharp, desperate edge, her defiance into a subtle, coded language. She had endured the waiting, the uncertainty, the isolation, the slanders.
She had faced the knowledge that the man she had loved and built her life upon was now meticulously planning her destruction. Now the slow grind of the stone walls was over. The time had come to step out of the crucible and onto the stage that Henry had so carefully prepared. The performance was about to begin.
The walk from her cell to Tower Green. It was the same path she had taken, radiant with royal expectation, just 3 years before. But now the air wasn't thick with triumph. It was heavy with humiliation. Guards flanked her, not bowing courtiers. The route was lined not with cheering subjects, but with silent, watchful eyes, some curious, some hostile, some perhaps fearful for themselves. This was the final degradation, a deliberate echo of her rise turned into a stark public fall. And then she saw it, the scaffold. Not a grand raised platform like the ones depicted in later dramas designed to elevate the condemned above the crowd in a show of grim authority. This one was low, unsettlingly low, perhaps only 3 feet high. It was a deliberate choice. It kept her close to the ground, close to the people who had once hailed her, now encouraged to witness her shame up close. There was no distance, no separation. It was designed for maximum exposure, maximum impact on the onlookers who were part of the performance. Tudor executions were not the somber, hushed affairs we might imagine. They were public spectacles, intended as grim lessons. The government wanted a crowd, wanted the energy, the buzz. Vendors sold food and drink. Children clung to their parents, gawking. And seated among the genuine spectators were the king's men, paid to shout the right slogans. God save the king, to drown out any whispers of dissent, to ensure the narrative of righteous justice was proclaimed aloud. Anne would have heard it all. The murmur of the crowd, the distant city bells that would toll not in mourning, but in announcement of her death. And the staged cheers meant to solidify her condemnation. She was allowed to speak, a tradition, yes, but less a kindness and more an opportunity for confession and submission. What could she say? Defend herself against charges she knew were lies and risk her daughter's life? Rail against the king who controlled every aspect of her end and potentially condemn those she left behind to further ruin? Her words were a masterclass in constrained defiance, a final, subtle act of resistance. "Good Christian people," she began, her voice clear, reaching across the hushed crowd, "I am come hither to die, according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." On the surface, submission, an acceptance of her fate. But look closer. According to the law, and by the law I am judged to die. She acknowledged the legal process, the sentence pronounced by the law. She did not say, according to justice, or because I am guilty. She did not confess the fantastical crimes. Therefore, I will speak nothing against it. She wouldn't rail against the system that condemned her precisely because it would be futile and dangerous. Her final words were a carefully constructed, diplomatic farewell that maintained her innocence for posterity while appearing to submit to the king's will. It was a silent declaration wrapped in the language of obedience, a last desperate attempt to preserve her legacy in the only way left. And where was Henry? Not there. Miles away at Whitehall Palace, already mentally, perhaps even physically, moving on. He would be formally engaged to Jane Seymour the very next day. Anne's death was not a tragedy to him, it was a transaction, a logistical step in the relentless pursuit of a male heir. The final preparations. She did not rest her head on the traditional English block. This was the French method. She knelt upright, her back straight, with no support for her neck. She had to hold herself still, knowing that any tremor of fear, any instinctive flinch, could ruin the executioner's aim and lead to a horrific, agonizing end. The blindfold was placed over her eyes, again, not for mercy, but to prevent her seeing the sword, preventing a flinch that could spoil the clean strike. Witnesses described her lips moving in silent prayer as she knelt there, a fragile, solitary figure on the low stage. Her head twitched slightly beneath the blindfold, perhaps straining to hear the faint rustle of the executioner's movement, the whisper of the blade being drawn. Jean Rambaud, the artist of death, added one final cruel flourish. Just as he was about to swing the sword, he took a step to the side and shouted, perhaps something like, "Where is my sword?" distracting her, making her turn her head instinctively towards the sound, exposing her neck perfectly. She never saw it coming. The French sword, lighter, sharper, designed for speed and precision, flashed horizontally. A single clean strike. One moment she was Queen Anne, alive, praying, terrifyingly still. The next, her head tumbled from her shoulders, landing with a soft thud in the straw. The crowd, moments before, buzzing with morbid anticipation, fell into a stunned collective silence. And for a few seconds, those 30 long, horrifying seconds, some witnesses swore her eyes still fluttered, her lips still moved. Was it prayer? Was it pain? Was it the final, fleeting echo of consciousness registering the void? We will never know. But the horror, the utter violation, was complete. The stage had been cleared. The performance was over. But the final act of her erasure was just beginning.
The silence didn't last, but it was a changed silence, pierced now by gasps, whimpers, perhaps even the retching of those overwhelmed by the visceral reality of what they had just seen. Jean Rambaud, the Calais executioner, completed his task. He lifted the severed head by its long, dark hair, holding it high for the crowd to see. A grim, triumphant statement. It is done. Blood still dripped from the ragged stump of her neck. Some fainted, others turned away. A few muttered prayers, while the king's men, perhaps unnerved themselves, resumed their shouts of, "God save the king." But the indignity wasn't over. Far from it. In the rush to dispense with the inconvenient queen, no coffin had been prepared. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few allowed back in the final moments, were left to handle the unthinkable. Devastated, trembling, they scrambled for something, anything, to contain the remains. They found an old arrow chest, a rough wooden box meant for storing weapons. This splintered, functional crate, designed for instruments of death, became the final container for the woman who had been Queen of England. No silken lining, no royal crest, no solemn procession. Just a makeshift box for a discarded problem. Her body and head were quickly bundled into the arrow chest and carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower walls. There she was buried hastily, without ceremony, beneath the flagstones. No proper Christian service, no priest's blessing, no hymns, no eulogy, and perhaps most chillingly, no headstone, no plaque. Nothing to mark the spot. Nothing to say that Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, had ever been laid to rest there. This wasn't just carelessness, it was deliberate. The point was to make her disappear, in death as in life. Henry's campaign of erasure went into overdrive immediately. Court painters were ordered to destroy her portraits. Her intricate emblems, the falcon, the entwined A and H, were scraped from palace walls. Her name became a dangerous whisper, her reputation systematically destroyed by propaganda. Courtiers who had sung her praises now parroted the official line. Traitor, temptress, witch. To speak of Anne Boleyn, positively or even neutrally, after May 19, 1536, was to invite suspicion, ruin, or worse. And the suffering didn't end with Anne. The people closest to her were left to bear the psychological scars. Her ladies-in-waiting, who had helped dress her for death and then lifted her decapitated body, were forever haunted. One reportedly fled to a convent, unable to face court life after the trauma. Others suffered sleeplessness, tremors, nightmares.
the recognizable symptoms of profound post-traumatic stress.
And then there was Elizabeth, her daughter, not yet 3 years old, a toddler still learning her ABCs. Within hours of Anne's death, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate by royal decree, stripped of her title, her status, her household. Her fine gowns and embroidered blankets were removed, her servants dismissed. She was left, effectively, an orphan, deemed a political inconvenience, her very existence a painful reminder of the repudiated queen. This was not just political expediency, it was cruelty aimed at a child, a chilling extension of the attack on Anne's legacy. And Anne hadn't died alone in her condemnation. 5 men, including her beloved brother, George Boleyn, had been executed in the days leading up to her death, accused of the same ludicrous crimes, adultery with the queen, treason. Their executions were not about punishing guilt. There was no credible evidence. They were about consistency. By executing them first, the state pre-validated the narrative. If these men were guilty, surely Anne must be too. They were silenced to ensure their voices couldn't contradict the official story. They were pawns in Henry's script, discarded once their role was played. These men's deaths were also public performances designed to reinforce the message. Tower Green became a stage for political theater, with the condemned as the unwilling actors and the crowd as the manipulated audience. Royal plants in the crowd ensured the right reactions: cheers for the king, boos for the condemned. It was a terrifying display of dominance. Challenge the king, reach too high, and this is your fate. Even the queen is not untouchable. Anne's carefully worded final speech, often lauded for its dignity, was a testament to the constraints placed upon her. Her praise of Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord wasn't affection. It was a final, desperate strategic move, hoping that outward submission might soften the ground for her daughter. It wasn't freedom of speech. It was censorship at the point of a blade. The precision of the execution, the imported swordsman, the blindfold, the kneeling posture without a block, every detail was designed for maximum efficiency and visual impact. It was a performance of control, ensuring a clean, swift end that was horrifying in its coldness, not in its messiness. Thomas Wyatt, the poet who had loved Anne, watched from his own tower cell. He wrote of her afterward, his grief etched into verses recalling the little neck, a private lament in a world where public mourning was forbidden. Anne was swallowed by the tower, buried without honor, her memory subjected to a state-sponsored purge. For centuries, her grave lay unmarked, her story distorted, reduced to whispers and myths. But Henry's plan failed, utterly and ironically. The daughter he declared illegitimate, the child whose existence he tried to erase against all odds, survived. Elizabeth Tudor not only reclaimed her birthright but ascended to the throne, becoming one of England's most formidable monarchs. Anne's bloodline, the very thing Henry sought to invalidate, became the most glorious dynasty in English history. Anne Boleyn wasn't just killed, she was unmade piece by piece. Her body discarded, her name slandered, her history rewritten. The psychological torment, the public humiliation, the choreographed death, it was all meant to prevent her bloodline from ever mattering, to ensure the name Boleyn was spoken only in disgrace. It didn't work, but the cost was immeasurable. From this distance, Anne's execution is more than just a tragic historical event. It's a stark, brutal case study in the architecture of tyranny. It shows how absolute power can weaponize narrative, how truth can be buried under spectacle and fear, how reputations can be destroyed not by evidence, but by calculated malice. Anne Boleyn's severed head on Tower Green wasn't just a gruesome relic. It was a symbol, a chilling reminder that under unchecked authority, even history itself can bleed. Her true legacy isn't just Elizabeth's reign. It's the uncomfortable, enduring lesson of how easily reality can be rewritten when power decides the script.